So yeah, thanks so much to Alex for being like a total legend in helping make this happen, because I had this idea actually in January and it's taken us all year to sort of ferment it and then realize it whilst we're spinning many plates. But and thank you to everyone for coming, and it's so nice to meet lots of new people through this as well as, you know, invite some people that I do know well to come together and look at some of these questions with us. It feels to me very important that whilst I know certain practitioners and professionals and academics in the field of deliberative and participatory democracy, there's a whole bunch of us like difficult activists getting all up on your patch and going and like organizing things that people do themselves. And you know, it started obviously for many of us with Extinction Rebellion advocating for citizens' assemblies. And we heard at the book launch last night that I went to with Graham Smith about, you know, on the one hand, how elated someone like him was to walk down Whitehall and find the road blocked with a bunch of people explaining to people on the street how a citizens' assembly worked, which if you're him must have been like fucking nuts. But also, you know, how that sometimes gets seen as a bit of a problem, or it's a bit difficult that, you know, there's all these kind of people getting excited about democratic innovation who aren't academics, or they're not sort of part of the groups that actually do the delivery, possibly on behalf of the state or big institutions or whatever. And what I can feel from looking at the space is that actually a lot of success has come through citizen initiated stuff, like in Ireland and the Global Assembly, and lots of like valid things start that way. But it's really, I'm having these conversations to try and offer a convening and conversation, sort of creating resource that can explore some of the challenges in the field, really, in order that we can share it out with the wider movement, some of which is very, very grassroots, some of which is attached to some kind of notable bits of activism like Extinction Rebellion, but also some is just people working in communities doing work that's often quite far away from some of the sort of pro practitioners. And the last conversation like this that we had was really wonderful, actually, to hear some of those people that I'd never met before from that kind of expert space say it's really great to meet some of the people who are doing a bit of that work on the ground, often with not much resource, and, you know, trying to learn how to do it the best way that you can with quite limited access to time, money, expertise, you know, and all of that kind of stuff. So the purpose of these conversations is really to try and sort of open up some of the conversations that I think are live in the space, which I know from talking to Claire about this one, for example, over a drink one day or something like that, that it's a live conversation in the sort of expert space. And it's also a bit of a live conversation on the ground. But not in the conversations aren't sort of merging. So I'm hoping this is a bridge building and, you know, knowledge sharing and network strengthening kind of exercise on multiple different fronts. That's my intention anyway. So probably I just hand over to you, Alex, if we're going to do some breakout rooms to people say quickly hello to each other.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to put this into like 3 breakout rooms. It's like 5 people each, and so we'll get 5 minutes. So you have like 1 minute each to sort of like say a little intro to yourself. So maybe 30 seconds each, and then have a little chat. And then I will call us back after sort of 4 minutes, give 60 seconds, and then we'll be back here in 5 minutes. So I'll just open those rooms now. Thank you. Well, I'm sure that left you cut short. Sorry. But there's Marriott. We'll get moving. Claire, do you want to introduce Claire M and why this question? And then Claire M, if you have like 5 minutes to unpack your thoughts about it a little bit before we go to everyone else.
Yeah, sure. So we've already shared a bit of the problem definition discussion for this because as I said in the last one, I introduced it this way. Basically, I spoke to Graham Smith about doing this sort of set of conversations, and he said, I think you should really define the questions very well before you start, which is like a really academic thing to say, and not the kind of thing that I would naturally do. So then I actually took a lot of time to sit down somebody who could speak sort of to the issue really well, so we define it. So I do think this is really well defined, and I think, you know, there's a lot of apprehension, I think, about whether or not assemblies are neutral things or not, or whether they can be held in a way where people think they've got balance. And I'm conscious that a lot of the things that present as balance in our world, like the BBC, for example, are often end up tying themselves in knots and not really being able to do the things that they might want to do, because they feel they have to sort of self-censor themselves or do false equivalents, like that woman, I've forgotten her name, who left and made that big banging speech about how there's no you can't be neutral when the president of the United States says you should inject bleach as a solution to a pandemic. So this kind of conversation, that's it, Emily Maitlis. So this conversation for me is like very live, because of all the work I'm doing on the grassroots, trying to support a project called the Humanity Project to get people to set up their own assemblies. At the same time, we want diverse participation, and we want to make sure that they don't feel like they've been sort of led by the nose. And I think one of the answers to the question is this, potentially, in the concept of integrity, which was so helpful for you to suggest, Claire, that there's something else that we could talk about that's not called the pretense of being a neutral person. And I think in light of the genocide that's happening at the moment and the climate crisis, and there's lots of reasons why you might not want to bring in every single person into a debate about what to do about ending the fossil fuel industry, for example, or whatever it is that you think you might need to achieve, you know, democratically. So go on, Claire, you can say it all better than I can.
Well, the question we have is there really anything neutral about an assembly or a facilitator? So there are two components there, the assembly and the facilitator. I think a lot of you on this call have, you know, experience as facilitators or as process designers, or both, or more and more. And I came to start engaging with neutrality, impartiality, integrity, all these concepts as in my practice as a facilitator. I think that's where these questions emerged for me initially. But then I was confronted with these principles when designing processes, which is quite different, I would say. So I think there are two parts to that question, and maybe we can find parallels, overlaps. Maybe we need, you know, and that's up to us to decide whether we want to have more of a conversation around facilitation or more about these processes and how they're designed. But briefly, I'll start maybe with the facilitators' experience, and then that will lead me to what I mean by integrity or impartiality in design. So when I was facilitating at citizens' assemblies, some of the first assembly I facilitated were on climate. The very first one was actually on air quality, was Kingston Air Quality Citizens Assembly back in 2019, BC, before COVID. And one of the assembly members who had been selected by Sortition is actually a leading academic in deliberative democracy, and that some of you know, John Boswell. And I was facilitating the deliberation, and he was at my table, and so I felt very much on the spot in that process, and I was constantly reflecting back on my practice, and also I was observing probably a lot more than I would normally, because I knew he was there as a citizen engaged in the process, but also as an academic researching. And he published a piece called "Seeing Like a Citizen," which is surfacing which I think is fascinating because it's his explanation of his experience as an assembly member through the lens of the academic eyes. And he was raising lots of issues that he had observed in the process around treating people in a way that was quite neutral and not doing justice to the power asymmetries, for instance, between assembly members, and how that was creating some sense of awkwardness, you know, and how we needed to, from his perspective, he was being very positive also about all the efforts that were put in this process, but at the same time acknowledging all these questions we're grappling with around neutrality of processes and power asymmetries. So that was my first kind of reckoning with this question. And then it kept coming back, surfacing in other processes. And probably the most, when it translated from the experience of facilitation to process design, was with the Global Assembly. And I'm glad Mary Nasser is here on this call, because she was one of the assembly members from Syria who was involved in the Global Assembly. And I'm really interested in her perspective as an assembly member, you know, experiencing being facilitated. And for me, that's when I started reflecting on neutrality of process design, and how with the Global Assembly, we were confronted with thinking about climate change through the lens of the global context, and not, for instance, the European context of how citizens' assemblies have been designed, for instance, or the experience I had of them, and how we, this idea of, for instance, in Climate Assembly UK, they were using the concept of a provision of information that was balanced, comprehensive, and I forgot the third term. And I was trying to think, can we have these kind of principles with the Global Assembly? And through the Knowledge and Wisdom Committee, we started surfacing some of the power question we really needed to acknowledge. And so that's when we came up with a series of underpinning principles and values that were underpinning the process design for the Global Assembly. And from that's when I really started to use the term integrity rather than neutrality, because we had principles we were acknowledging. So I don't want to speak more than that, because I think there's so much on the call, so many people who have a lot of experience in there. So I'll leave it there. But that's the problem definition, maybe.
Thanks, Claire. It would be really great. Yeah, I've asked. I sent messages to people saying, like, if you had stories for insight to bring, sort of that's grounded in perhaps some experience you've had, or some sort of a particular way of communicating some of these experiences yourself that you wanted to share, it'd be really good to hear. And we can this won't be the only, as I said, this won't be the only opportunity you get to talk, but it's just a way to get us started, to have some of these stories for insight, like looking at the different aspects of the question from your perspective and your work. And I thought it would be good, because Claire and I had actually been reading some of Rosa's and Oliver's work, and we sort of got quite excited about it, and we asked specific questions of Rosa and Oliver. It might be good to start with you two, if that's okay. Rosa, can we come to you first and then go to Oliver?
Sure. Thank you so much for organizing this and for the invitation. Claire, I loved your framing when I watched the video of the first one that you did with Graham. And Claire, thank you so much for all that you said. I'm particularly appreciating your breaking out a bit the two realms of can we be neutral as facilitators, and we be neutral as process designers, because I think that those are in fact different things, and they may have some overlaps. But my story, my 2-minute story, is on the facilitator end of things. And it's really, just want to say that the idea that I'm supposed to be neutral as a facilitator feels quite alien to me, because it's very different from how I was originally trained in a multi-partial or taking all sides approach. Bit of a story is that my friend Tom Atlee had invited me to attend my first facilitation workshop, and I really didn't want to go, because what I'd heard, this was 24 years ago, what I'd heard about facilitation at that point was that it was all about herding cats or getting people to color inside the lines, and neither of those interested me the slightest, especially as an introvert who was not particularly comfortable in groups, right? So, but Tom promised that this would be different. And what finally persuaded me to attend is that he had invited a significant number of social change activists that he knew, who had been quite active in organizing the 1999 anti-WTO forum in Seattle, US. And the usual attendees of these facilitation workshops, however, were mid-level managers in business and in government. So you can imagine the diversity that was present in that room. And 20 minutes into our first demo, there was a level of genuine curiosity and open-mindedness that started showing up that was really mind-blowing to me. And all that the facilitator seemed to be doing was listening deeply to each person, empathizing and reflecting back what they were hearing, while also writing it down on a large flip chart paper. And so I later learned that in family therapy, this approach is called multidirectional partiality, but this is complicated, way too long of a term, or multi-partiality. But I really prefer to think of it much more simply as taking all sides. And ever since then, it seems clear to me that as facilitators, we're not machines, and it doesn't make sense to pretend to be. And it's also clear to me that the listening work we do, it's often taken for granted because it is invisible, but in fact, it is essential, right? Not just the fact that people are following the rules and taking turns and everybody gets a chance to speak, but there's an energy in listening, in presence, in caring, and those things are not often considered when we look at what it is that facilitators do. So I think we need to care about everybody rather than not care about anybody. So thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. It's wonderful. It's really lovely to hear that story, and at that precise moment in time as well. Oliver.
Yeah, so I'm going to change my story, I think. We might come back because Alex was suggesting that maybe I illustrate the distinction between backstage and front stage, and we might come on to that. But that's more to do with the design and the context for processes, assemblies of all kinds. But I want to focus first on facilitation. I was just listening to Rosa, and I was just thinking that there are two quotes about listening that that I got from two teachers of mediation, which is the space where I learn about facilitation more formally. And one of them is imagine that we thought of conversations as a dynamic in which we take turns at listening. Right, so shifting the emphasis. And the other one is, the challenge is to speak in ways that empower others to listen, and listen in ways that empower others to speak. Right. So in many ways, facilitators try to accomplish a space where those kind of things can happen. Right. But for me, this all started. My first experiences of facilitation were as part of the student movement in Spain in the early 2000s. In 2001. There was a new piece of legislation that was diminishing the power of students in governance bodies within universities, changing a lot of the features that were pro-student, including scholarships, etc. So for 4 months, students took over Spanish universities, most of them, and we stopped the university as it was, and we tried to demonstrate how the university could work differently. And a key element of that was to create assemblies. And this happened in all major universities. I was in Santiago in Galicia. So in my university, we had the faculty assemblies and the popular assembly. But very soon, and many here will be familiar with the dynamics and perhaps in the student movement or even in trade unions movements, etc. Sometimes it can get very close to the Life of Brian type of situation with all the factions and so it soon became clear that there was going to be a need for some of us to step back a little bit and hold the space so that others could work through their disagreements. And that's for the first time. I was studying political science. I was all about talking and persuading others and debating, which comes from debatire, to beat down. So you learn to beat down your opponents. And it's taken probably 20 years to begin to unlearn some of those habits, which is another journey of facilitators, I guess. But for me, that was the first time when I began to appreciate this dilemma of neutrality and impartiality, because on the one hand, impartiality was important, because otherwise I couldn't gain the trust of different parts of the movement. Part of the deal we made is that all the student unions put down their flags, and it became a genuine assembly movement where everything we did was through assemblies, not through factions or unions attached to parties, etc. And impartiality was important, but neutrality was an absolute no-go, because your job as a facilitator is to intervene, especially to disrupt some of the power inequalities that shape group dynamics. So I'm against neutrality, but I think impartiality in some contexts is really important, especially in situations with profound disagreement or where you want genuine deliberation to happen. I think I'm gonna stop there, but this is to say that context is really gonna matter in this conversation, because it is undeniable that our practices are guided by values. That is not in question. You can't, it's like one of my big issues with deliberative democratic theory is that it's so focused on procedures and proceduralism, at least in some versions now, that, just to put it simply, you cannot deliberate on a dead planet, and you cannot deliberate with a roof over your head and an empty stomach. So to me, a lot of the work I'm doing now is trying to see what have we lost along the way from the strand of participatory democracy that cared about the socioeconomic conditions that then enable good deliberation. And I think we need to recover that. So there's no neutrality in values, but those values need to be agreed. And then we need to hold the spaces where multiple perspectives and values can be brought in conversation.
Thank you, Oliver. Yeah, that's really full. It's really clear and really just memorable moments actually in that. Please feel free to put your hands up if you would want to contribute a story. Manfred or Martin or Liz or Granat or Mary. Is that Manfred? Yeah.
First of all, I would also like to thank you for the invitation. On the one hand, for me, it's always interesting to meet colleagues who work on similar topics, but to me, this topic was really pretty personal the more I pondered about it. And I agree that it's probably not so much about being neutral, but especially the topic of integrity touched me, because if I'm honest, this is the reason why I quit a job at the government where I worked for almost 30 years. And to make a long story short, I was hired in the early 90s by a government. And the idea, and I find it really interesting because today we think polarization is a new phenomenon, but it isn't. We already could witness this phenomenon in the early 90s, and the government was pretty concerned about the growing gap between government and society. So they founded an organization, and our job was to find ways to bridge that gap. And that's how we came sooner or later into experimenting with new democratic approaches. And for me, it was always clear that if you facilitate or design such processes, it's very important that you reflect on your own attitude. Why are you doing this? With what purpose, with what goals in mind? And for me, it was always central to serve the process and to facilitate to narrow this growing gap between society and government. For me, the critical part is in the beginning we thought the difficult part is to invite citizens to take part in such processes because there is so much distrust. But the longer we worked on it, we realized that the real difficulty is on the side of government and administration, because there is such a fear of losing control. And so I think there is a huge responsibility in the organization that is facilitating but also organizing the whole process. And I think you cannot stress enough that it's so important to really reflect what you're experiencing there. And it took me really a while. We had a change in government, and our government was always very much in favor of these processes, but there was a very slight shift towards more being populistic and not really interested in participatory approaches. And so for me, the critical part is not so much the facilitation, it's really the design and to dealing with these energies and interests. And so this is really critical. And I often wonder when I'm at events about citizen assemblies or wisdom council, stuff like that, we often talk about methodologies, but very rarely about attitudes and values and the conflicts that emerge out of these processes. So I think this conversation is really important. Thank you.
Thanks, Manfred. Claire, did you want to come back at all on anything you've heard so far? I thought, like I had an idea that maybe give you a chance.
One thing I wanted to say was this piece about context that's came up, because the idea that a facilitator's job is to be sort of neutral is sort of similar to the idea of them being even-handed or sort of taking all of the sides, but then it's quite different to the idea of them interrupting something in order to make the situation more equitable or more fair for somebody or easier for somebody to be part of it. And I just thought that feels like it's a big word to put in their context, and especially in current British politics, which some of you will know more intimately than others, but it feels like, well, similarly what we've seen going on in America, in my view, is this sort of destruction of the possibility of context and nuance. And if you really make that impossible to sort of find, then you also somehow, I don't know, you sort of feel like you live in a much more oversimplified version of reality, if you know what I mean, where there isn't a real doesn't feel like anyone's got any respect at the moment for like recognizing the fact that context exists basically, in a way. And so when we're working on the ground, what I'm trying to work out is how would we help some people in one place to set up an assembly process versus in a different place where they're very, very different contexts. And so instead of the original attempt in the Humanity Project to do a big wide net and do it like a movement building sort of mobilization, we're going to like very specific tiny number of places to try and refine a way of working which is much more deep with people who are like situated in a place and know it very well, so that then it's going to probably turn out quite a different thing in all of the different places, which is hard to get my head around when I'm thinking, yeah, but we need a movement. And how can you make a movement out of lots of things that all have to be very, very different in all of the different places? Because starting XR was really about having sort of recipes and tools and ways of doing things that people could sort of pick up and run with and replicate and stuff like that. And this feels like it's not that. But the word context is big. Is a big one to take home with me, I think.
Thanks, Claire. Liz or Liz Martin, Granas, Mary, would you like to share, Liz?
Yeah.
Liz and then Martin. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex, and setting this up, and to both Claires for the way you frame this. It's really helpful, and I kind of want to dive straight in. There's so many kind of questions firing off for me, so I'll try and help me, Alex, if I start to spill over a bit. I mean, I come into this having worked in facilitation and working with organizations and social movements over about 30 years or so. And I'm more recently with citizens' assemblies. So, and I think somebody mentioned mediation as well. That also informs the way I work. And one of my main influences, actually, when I first started in community development was Paulo Freire, the adult educationalist. And that really has impacted my way I understand power. And I think, to me, if you're coming into facilitation, you've got to have some theory of power, really. And I think, and a theory of change too. And to my mind, that informs the way you design process, but also the way you show up. And that shows up in your micro practices as well as the macro, the backstage, front stage, as you were saying, Oliver. And I suppose for me, yeah, I mean, I often find myself working with dilemmas and tensions and differences. And to me, it's very much about how, as a facilitator, that you hold those and not to kind of collapse into one or the other, because that's where polarization happens. But in holding that, something new might emerge, something a third way potentially. But it's being able to hold that space long enough. And I think that's where I often find the tension in citizens' assemblies, because there is this need to kind of get to producing recommendations when actually some of that much deeper work where you can really start to surface some of the differences that are keeping some of these big kind of messy, complex issues stuck aren't really allowed to come through. I think where you have more longer time, and some of the processes I've been involved in a few now, both the global assembly through to national and at local level, where you have more space and you're less, you get a balance between the critical thinking that's needed, but also working with all aspects, the head, the heart, the body, creativity, being able to really bring different ways of knowing in. And I think the choices we make are fateful, really, in terms of where processes end up. So I suppose some of those tensions for me around, expert knowledge vis-a-vis more experiential learning, for example, using creativity, like some of the work you've been doing here. And so I think some of the process where I find when I'm trying to facilitate a group, and particularly like in the global assembly, there was more space for that, where you could bring creativity, but also you could bring different cultural expressions, people coming from all over the globe. And I think the group I was facilitating there, where you had people from Nigeria and Egypt and Zambia and Italy, there were power imbalances there. And it's like, for me, it was about how to, as much as possible, minimize those whilst recognizing my own privilege and position as a white woman from the UK. So that self-awareness to me is key. I think it's about also how to use processes that actually can get a shift in the room. This might not always, for me, be the traditional kind of citizens assembly approach, but I think the backstage stuff, for example, one process I was involved in my home city, getting the politicians on board was so key. And so using a process called the fishbowl method, where we invited members of citizens jury who had gone through a process into the middle of the room with the commissioners of the different councils who had commissioned this particular citizens jury, and facilitated a process where the senior politicians and the management team were sitting outside the fishbowl looking in, and they heard stuff about what happened and how people were impacted personally, but also in terms of the changes that they felt needed to happen, but also the experience of how that local authority worked and how alienating it was in terms of the culture and the way that the local authority worked and the way they'd handled this difficult issue, quite a contentious issue in my home city, which had got very polarized around transport. And I suppose that for me, you could see just how the politicians, suddenly they kind of got it in a way that they didn't before. So I think that more experiential learning and the choices we make as facilitators and how we use our power well in service of what the overall intention is, to me, is critical. So I think the point about integrity to me it really speaks to me. I think there is, I don't think—
Liz, I might wrap you up there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think neutrality, yeah. We can't do neutrality.
Brilliant, thank you. Granats, I saw your hand up.
I will take it from Liz that as a cluster facilitator of citizen assembly or global assembly, I feel like that there is also a power dynamics between a facilitator and assembly member. When we take this power dynamic, not like academic or positionality, like their own professions, but from global north to global south as well. When we compare or we start conversation with the assembly member, I facilitate like Bangladesh, Azerbaijan, Iran, Nepal, Bangladesh. And most of the interesting part was that gender dynamics also influenced this conversation. And my community hosts was men, all of them were men. So, and I was the woman, and I need to sometimes balance my positionality as a facilitator to talk to them and to ask them different tasks. And this is something I think we need to discuss when we design or we talk to design or we try to implement citizen assembly. And also one thing that it also feel like that we need to relearn or unlearn or practices which we already learned when we implement something in global south, where people have their own lived experiences, their own indigenous knowledges. And we cannot push them to by saying that this research paper said or this research said, because they have their own knowledge and you need to learn this knowledge from them. And there I feel like that they always love their own knowledge and they value it. And this is something I want to connect with the integrity. And they feel like that you need to listen to them and what they are saying and what they are experiencing. And last one comment is that the design, like, for example, when we design something, we need to onboard those people who experience the thing, experience the trauma or crisis, whatever. We don't need to just depend on the research paper which has done by someone who is living in Germany, but hire a research assistant to do this research in India. We need to learn or we need to break this barrier from a practitioner or someone who is writing a research paper.
Thanks, Pranas. Martin, I saw you nodding along. Would you like to share a story?
I can share a story. Recently, I met a group who is organizing assemblies in the state of Baden-Württemberg, is the South state in Germany, and I thought it was going to be very typical in the sense that we want to do a film about them to portray their history and because they've been doing this like 13 years now. And I thought it was very interesting in the sense of relating to the whole concept of integrity, because for them, the assemblies is only about mediation. They actively read the newspapers and then they find a spot of some kind of crisis and conflict, and then they call up the either city mayor or local mayor, and then they have a conversation with them, and then they offer them a process how they could start to listen or see all the different sides, map the conflict. And I think it's really interesting in the sense of the principles as the key guidance, because since social media has given more power to the extreme voices, the larger, and he says this, the majority is more and more silent, and we're losing these different nuances and all the gray tones and all the larger picture, and they're basically just trying to complete that picture through the process by mapping the conflict and then randomly selecting citizens to look at that larger map and try to offer some possible solutions. And that's why I think I think you said it, Claire, the whole context, out of which context do certain principles evolve. And so I can just, I think that story might be interesting. And I don't, because especially if I noticed the assemblies I was in, I've never seen a neutral facilitator. Because if I noticed in one assembly, in the climate assembly in Austria, we had the politicians coming over on the fourth weekend, and then they had, and then the members of the citizens assembly members were able to talk to the politicians, and the rules that they set up for themselves, how to talk with each other, listen to each other, the facilitators weren't able to apply those rules between the members of the assembly and the politicians. So the politicians got screamed at and interrogated, and it was very, very difficult for the facilitators not to kind of keep a balance. And I find it really difficult if there's not some checks and balances or some kind of mutual support also under the facilitators to hold that space. And I find it very tricky in certain circumstances. It's like a mediator. Sometimes you need two mediators to be able to do that. So
thank you, Martin. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Mary, do you want to share something of your experience?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, my experience with the Global Assembly, I can say it was great. So I like the idea of inclusivity, integrity, equity, and equality. So all people get the space to be heard and express their ideas and share ideas with others. I didn't have any problem, honestly, with connecting with my colleagues in the breakout. So the facilitation was like organized, and all my colleagues can have the chance to participate and talk about their ideas. But meanwhile, I don't know. I do believe that the Global Assembly created a lot of climate defenders, and many of the members still working on climate change issues and how we can address climate change. But I don't think that all members do the same thing. Maybe few of them like forget about Global Citizen Assembly. Maybe they were there just for curiosity. So my question is that how we can design the program of how we can measure the impact of their participations on their communities and on the global level. So I don't know, maybe we can do the representative on many levels. So maybe the main representative should represent other people. So I don't know how we can design this, but this is my idea.
Thanks, Mary. And Marriott, can you speak, or are you just listening?
What?
Actually,
Marriott wrote in the chat earlier that she had a listening only role.
Gotcha.
The train.
That's
but
fine. Yeah, that's fine. Thanks. I missed it. Claire, Mellier, I just wanted to come back to you. I wanted to see if you wanted to sort of pull out any threads or respond to anything, and then we'll sort of open it up and popcorn it a bit, and people can just put their hand up, or in the chat, and I can take it, and we can go from there a bit, and then we'll do that for a bit, and then maybe see if we can collectively draw some themes out of this that we think are important. Sorry, Claire, have I put you on the spot?
No, I mean, I'm really interested in maybe more of a conversation, but maybe I feel we've touched upon power, but I'd like to go more in depth on this, because for me that's what, particularly around the process design, I think there are so many framings that prevent us from maybe looking at more like the hardcore dilemmas, because of the blind spots that we have, which is problematic to some extent, I think. So I'm interested maybe in that. What does that mean, in terms of process design and power analysis, and especially in the context that Claire and Alex are interested in the more bottom-up claimed, deliberative assemblies. How would that, compare to more top-down institution-led assemblies?
Claire?
I suppose I've got a question which might have an obvious answer that I don't know, because I'm not an expert, but one of the things that people keep saying about, like what you've just alluded to, Mary, like asking the question, what does the impact create afterwards? And how people can become quite mobilized on an issue. And Graham said last night, the Climate Assembly people from the UK Assembly, they sort of found 2 years down the line that they're still very committed to environmental behaviors, let's say. And that seems to sort of have a lasting effect on them. But if this discussion is partly because we're all trying to like create more democratic systems and processes, and I'm personally trying to reimagine how you could like run society in a way which is actually feels democratic and kind and doesn't self-terminate or turn into fascism. So you know, there's a reason why I'm doing it. But it strikes me that actually, if you have these kinds of processes with people, they become politicized. The power that they often don't have, it seems to me, is the power that I always complain about, because I didn't go to a posh school. So I didn't get taught how to do debates, and I didn't get taught how to do public speaking. And I have learned how to like take up space and be quite noisy, but only out of necessity, I would say, not because anyone helped me to sort of realize myself as someone who should have a political life, or, you know, a loud voice that other people listen to. And it sounds like that's one of the power imbalances, that the people who come in and present, like yesterday, we had a sort of simulation of like an experience of a little bit of a citizens assembly, basically in a hard art session at our friend's studio. And they invited like 2 sets of views about aviation, which is why Jeremy made that joke at me about sustainable aviation fuel at the start of the call, because we had one guy who used to be a pilot who's a climate activist, and we had somebody else who's the sustainability rep from Heathrow Airport, who came and told us a lot of stuff that I thought was absolute bollocks about how the aviation industry is going to like green itself up. But his presentation was extremely smart and polished, and he was confident and he knew how to speak. And Todd is an activist who doesn't like public speaking, and presented much more emotionally and much more engagingly in lots of ways for me personally, but that's because I already agree with him. But it's a real power imbalance for then people talking about the thing that they've been talking around, to not be able to sort of quite present the ideas. And I'm interested in talking with this group Dash Arts about doing political speech writing workshops, because it feels like if you're going to help some people to find political agency, you may also like scaffold a bunch of support around them so they can learn the tools that you need to use to participate in public life. And one of them is traditionally debate. I liked what you said about that, Oliver. I've never heard anyone say it's about beating down, but that is what it feels like. But there's alternatives to debate, you know, being a comedian, being a compere, being a good MC, being a good host, being a, you know, there's all kinds of different ways that you can be good at carrying conversation. And that feels like that's a real power thing, being able to have the skills to communicate in a way. I don't know if that's a useful thing to ask about power.
Yeah, so Claire, I mean, Rose has put her hand up, but just to sort of clarify then, it's a question about how you facilitate and process design to mitigate or think about power from the grassroots level for those who don't necessarily feel that they have or express that they have power. Rosa?
Well, I don't want to take the conversation on a different track here, but there are areas of what Claire just shared that I feel really strongly about, which are that a repeated outcome we see a lot in citizens' assemblies is that participants do feel much more empowered, right? And you're talking about now, how do we build on it and give them, you know, debate training, or in Denmark, they're doing coaching training and leadership training and organizing training. And I think all of those are very interesting ideas. But I just want to, you know, go back to something else you said, which is, you know, we all have our own purposes for doing the citizens' assemblies, and something that we haven't really brought up here is the whole question of trauma, right? And healing, and where does polarization come from, right? And some people, who was it who said this recently? I really like to give credit to people, but I forget where I heard this. Somebody was talking about citizens' assemblies as depolarization machines. I don't know if that was you, Claire, or anyway. But I just want to come back a little bit to, and it's not the only reason to do them, and it's not the main purpose of doing them necessarily. For a lot of people, it's like, I know a lot of people, it's like, well, we want to come up with a good law and then make the government implement it because we want to deal with this climate situation, and that's all very valid. But in addition, I don't know how familiar people are with deep canvassing, it's that, right? So it's like, we have a lot of evidence that what is it that allows people to be in a situation where they actually reconsider and change their minds? And one of the things that happens is that if we have a small group, and this is where context is really important, right? I'm not talking about giving a fascist a platform from which they can speak uncontestedly to 5,000 people at once. But I'm saying that we know that if we have a small group where everybody has the opportunity to be heard, and everybody will be heard, so they will get to speak, but others will get to speak too, in that kind of non-judgmental atmosphere, that's when people actually open their minds and change and shift. And there are incredibly powerful stories that we have of people who have made significant shifts as a result of not getting shut down, of not getting told, you can't say that, that's not PC, right? So
Rosa,
what?
I just want to say if you could wrap up soon, because and then
Yes,
Oliver's going to come in as
I
well.
will. I will
Yeah.
wrap up. So there it is. Just where does the project of healing trauma and depolarization fit into this whole thing? Because assemblies can be an amazing way to do that. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of there's so many things that have come up that so I'm trying to, but I'm going to try to connect a couple of things. So the point that Claire was making about power at that micro level of the resources and rhetorical skills. I mean, rhetorical skills are amongst the most unequally distributed resources in society because, again, it really depends on so many things, from your background, your upbringing, your access to education, and then the spaces where you get to contribute. And because we lack or we have lost, most societies, there are parts of society that haven't, but societies as a whole have lost the art of the political ritual of trying to make sense together and trying to work through things. When we create spaces like citizens' assemblies, I mean, one of the stories that always gets told, and I know there are some people here who were part of the Scottish Climate Assembly that we had up here, and there are always these compelling stories of individuals who haven't had a chance before and who thrive in this space, although on paper they probably, you wouldn't think they will be very active contributors. We anyone who's been in these spaces, we get captivated by these because but in a way, what that speaks of is our, how we've lost the understanding that these are actually human qualities that we have been suppressing because of all kinds of structural forces, right? So deliberation and facilitation, these practices are, now there's a lot of critique that this is an imposition from the global north. I don't buy it. The history of facilitation, the history of deliberation is as old as humanity, and it belongs across the world. And archaeologists and anthropologists now are beginning to kind of show and tell a different story of how human communities self-organized and develop and so on. And facilitators have been there ever since there have been power inequalities within groups. So in a way, for me, the point that Claire was making, Claire Farrell, about this unequal rhetorical skills, and that points to the need for facilitators who try to create a space where those things are not completely distorting of the dynamics that can emerge in a group. I mean, another question is, can we ever do away with facilitators? And maybe that's the sort of, if we get to a point where we recover some of our rituals of public encounter and capacity for self-governance of communities and so on. And for that, we need all these things, the popular assemblies, the citizens' assemblies, other kinds of spaces that are very different from assemblies. But in the end, for me, it boils down to that human capacity to work on self-governance, on self-determination. And for that, as back in history as we might want to go, you will find that some people need to step out of the flow of the conversation to create the space where the conversation can happen. And I don't think that's a problem, because if you're someone who has a lot to contribute, then you shouldn't be the facilitator. You should be a contributor to the conversation. So there's no incompatibility here. I've worked in activist spaces, institutional spaces, in community spaces, and it's just kind of, it's context, as I was saying. And there are all these different traditions. I won't go on, but Liz mentioned Paulo Freire. So that was the kind of facilitation embedded in community organizing that builds on Socratic dialogue, where you are actually taking a group in a direction, but it's not a direction that you are going to set. It's a direction of self-discovery, holding a mirror to yourself, learning something about yourself in your community and what that means and how that relates to oppressive forces and so on. And that's very different from facilitating an organizational context or in a conflict resolution context, and very different from what we do in citizens' assemblies. And this is sometimes one of the challenges in citizens' assemblies, that you have a team of 20 or 30 facilitators, and they all come from different traditions. And facilitating deliberation is a very different thing, because deliberation is a very highly demanding form of communication, different from debate, different from dialogue. These form different patterns of communication, and they have different building blocks, and facilitators need to be able to read that. And anyway, I won't go on, but yeah, the question of power is always there.
Thanks, Oliver. Liz, did you want to, you've been putting stuff in the chat, did you want to follow on from that?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, I just building on that, I think there is something, and it is staying more at the micro, rather recognizing that the macro influences the micro around, what might get played out in the room, which is linked to trauma and linked to some of the big systemic influences, and then how facilitators need, I think, in a way, to get their own supervision, or to have ways to hold each other to account, because you're going to carry a lot of the system and sometimes internalize that, which can really cloud, I think, your judgment, but also your ability to stay in the moment and present. So for me, there's really something here about, if we are serious about some of these deeper questions and holding a process, that you've got people who are equipped, and you've got the diversity in terms of life experience. But I think your point, Oliver, about some coherence of approach, I think is important, or at least talking about that. And I think even this question of neutrality isn't talked about, which is why I really welcome this, because there are different views on that in the kind of facilitation and deliberative democracy space. So more of this, please. And the discomfort, I think, that it might also raise too. Yeah.
Thanks, Liz. Does anyone else want to come in?
Maybe I'll come in really quickly. It appears that the question was a straw man, and having a straw man is always useful, because it means you can kind of take it apart and come up with an alternative. And I think my issue is to do with the straw man, is to do with who defines neutrality. And right at the beginning, neutrality was defined as a kind of somewhere within a kind of position within binaries, the BBC thing. The trouble with neutrality is, in those kind of definitions, is that it's defined by the status quo. And if assemblies are to do with upsetting the status quo, or at least kind of disrupting it and moving it on, then you also need new definitions of neutrality. So that if neutrality, the question was not just a straw man, but actually you take it seriously and then constitute what is neutral, then some of the conversations that come out, whether it is Oliver talking about the human qualities that have been suppressed and so on and so forth, I think then neutrality potentially becomes a useful term as long as it's not defined by the current conditions.
Thanks, Jeremy. Claire or anyone else want to come in? Do you want to come back on that, Claire, or Martin or Manfred? Was that a hand from you, Liz?
Yeah, just a quick one. I think there is, flipping it round though, there is for me something about how these processes are perceived by others in terms of being credible. And that's why the neutrality thing is often used. And I just think there is something about reframing this language in a way that, I think Claire's point about nuance and the kind of the political nous and skill in terms of how these processes are perceived, are they going to be seen as credible and have influence? And if you as a facilitator is perceived to be in a particular camp or on social media, that can really have an impact, you know, on the process. Just, you know, and I again, this is quite a delicate one, but I think it's one to be talked about in terms of how do you hold your boundaries whilst also, and as a citizen myself, whilst engaging these processes that you really care about and rejuvenating democracy at the same time. You know, that's kind of, it's a lot. Yeah.
Thanks, Liz. In the chat, Marit's asked, what then is neutrality if not defined by the current conditions? Oliver, you were going to come in, and then Rosa.
Yeah, very quickly, because I know others haven't spoken yet. So in Scotland's Climate Assembly, the first conversation we had in the stewarding board, where there were officials and politicians and activists and people from different sectors, was about what was the starting point, right? Could it, you know, and some people, because the point that Liz makes is really important, right? The story of any single assembly, this probably applies as well to popular assemblies, but let's stick with citizens' assemblies. The story of a citizens' assembly is told in 10 different ways, depending on who you're talking to. If you're talking to officials, you tell it in a particular way. If you're talking to activists, you will tell it in a different way. So you need to hold that very uncomfortable kind of, what's the word? Was Batkin's term? Anyway, it'll come back to me. But essentially, you're holding multiple meanings under one term and trying to play within that messy language game. And that's because you want it to be viable. And so you're trying to speak and make it legible to very different people, right? And you're trying to create a space that is a bridge between the street and the institutions. So it has to be legible to the institutions in a way that feels viable for them. And it has to feel legitimate enough that people will want to come in and use that bridge to try and reach institutions, right? So it's a very difficult thing. But in the Scottish Climate Assembly, that first conversation was, where do we start? Are we starting from zero? Some people confuse neutrality from starting from without pre-imposing anything. And the board decided that we start where Parliament was, which was the Climate Change Act 2019, which is pretty advanced as a piece of legislation compared to others. Not radical enough in my view, but that's nor here nor there. It's pretty advanced compared to others. So it was not starting from a value neutral position. It was starting from the climate emergency is here, is happening. Look around you. We need to act. We need long-term action based on short-term thinking. Short-term action based on long-term thinking. So you never start from. You start from a legitimate sense of common ground. That can be very close to the status quo. That's where it gets dangerous. But the question is, can these new civic institutions push things beyond that? And can you hold them in that tension between being legible and credible to all these different constituencies so that they create a new bridge? Now, within that bridge, whether we can push things forward then connects to other questions, because sometimes we think that the problem is just that part of the issue is that we think that institutions like the state and public institutions in general have more capacity than what they actually have to do things, which is why personally I think is we cannot place all the hopes on the state to act on this.
Thanks, Oliver. Thank you very much. Rosa, and then I might just go back to Claire then, and Claire, the two Claires, and see if we can wrap up, draw together the themes. You're still muted, Rosa.
Sorry. To build on something that Oliver said, something about how we're starting within the system and hoping, or close to where the system is, and we're hoping to be able to transform the system. There was a conversation this morning where there was a question that was posed in either or language of are citizens' assemblies supporting the system, or are they challenging the system? And I was just thinking a lot about Eric Olin Wright and some things that he wrote about this both and of that you can have something that can be a bit of a Trojan horse. It grows inside the system, and maybe it's helping the system in some ways, but then maybe it's also opening some room for something new to happen beyond the system. And so how it's not necessarily an either or, that something is either helping the system or it's challenging the system, right? So there's that. And then there's this, back to the topic we started though, this whole thing about how do we gain legitimacy? How do we gain credibility? And this whole question about impartial and what do we want impartial to mean, right? So definitely we don't want to be partial in the sense of we don't want to be favoring one side over another. Clearly, right? That's not going to help. And at the same time, it makes me think, again, to come back to multi-partiality or taking all sides. And it just makes me think of the Occupy phrase, which I'm actually not remembering exactly how it went, but it was something like, rather than we have no leaders, we are all leaders. And you could look at those two things and say, basically, they mean the same thing, right? Because if we are all leaders, it's kind of the same as we have no leaders. And yet, the emphasis of it is different. So likewise, taking all sides means we're being empathic to some degree with each person, which is what's needed for transformation. But we're not being partial. We're not being empathic to some people and not being empathic to others. And that doesn't mean that we don't recognize power issues. It just means that the people who are oppressors need to regain their humanity as much as the people who are oppressed need to regain their humanity, right? So anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Rosa. Claire, I'm going to hand back to you for a couple of minutes, and literally like 3 minutes you've got to try to sort of pull out the themes that you think have come up there that you want to leave us with, and then we'll just grab any from anyone else that Claire and Claire don't cover. So go for it, you two. Speak to each other.
Go on, Claire M.
Oh no, you did a brilliant job last time, so I can't. It's your session.
Okay, all right. Well, the thing that I think is a big theme, and thanks for that, good thing to end on, Rosa, about like the healing, the empathic, the transformative experience that it can be. I think that's like one of the really important things about this, that if I suppose that I have a therapist, and I do think that there's a sort of feeling of neutrality about her, even though she's someone that I pay to just be on my side and no one else is. And that's how it works. Otherwise it wouldn't work if she wasn't like just mine somehow. It's like a magical transformative dynamic that that you can pay for, which I find also very interesting. But so that's interesting to me. And the idea that's popped up earlier about facilitators having the ability to sort of like intervene and change the way the spaces are, and that sometimes that might mean that they need facilitation they might need support themselves. And, you know, there's one thing I'd started in Extinction Rebellion, which was a dialogues project to get people to talk about climate justice, because climate justice people sometimes bash each other over the head with their version of justice, and the biggest justice hurts the other person the most, and they back down, and everyone's arguing about justice, and they're not really working out how to be effective together and nice to each other and learn from each other. So I wanted to try and solve that problem inside the movement with a dialogic project, basically. And in the process of learning how to facilitate for that, we went through some key things that I remember were like, Ma, who some of you will know from working on the Global Assembly, who I got introduced to, she said, you have to host yourself first. And that's just basically a way of understanding that you have to be able to like hold your own trauma whilst you're supporting someone else to explore something difficult for them. But also then we felt like sometimes you need to support yourself afterwards because it's been quite difficult. And so there's a sort of question there about the power dynamics, but also the sort of effort that goes into being this principled and trying to hold things in the most thoughtful and kind and valuable way, but actually runs completely at odds with the idea of politics. If I say the word politics, that's got nothing to do with what that conversation is really about, which is about having integrity and being a kind person and being skillful or something like that. So there's something there that I think is extremely interesting to explore. And this pluriverse bit that's come up at the end is like so important at the moment for me, because the academic way of saying things can be legible and credible to a different audience. I understand speaking to different audiences, but at the moment when I'm trying to do some work that joins together like climate, racism and cost of living issues, and says, actually, how could we see those as interrelated things that we could hold in one place and have as a sort of self-conscious part of this effort to build community assemblies, knowing that we've got leadership on those three critical issues. And there's something there about speaking different languages and speaking different languages to institutions or power or whatever. That's actually, it's an enormous challenge to even just think about taking climate activists into somewhere where people are doing cost of living assemblies and they're just going to, not understand each other or whatever. How do you help to do that? And maybe that's not a neutral thing either, if you're really trying to intervene in a sort of misunderstanding or lack of ability to communicate. So yeah, and I think one of the early things that came up that we didn't talk about very much was about trust and like the fear of losing control. And that's also a bit of a kind of power. That's a power question for another day, I guess. But I've seen a lot of people frightened of letting go of things. I've also watched facilitators totally lose control of a space because room full of activists are very hard to facilitate. I've seen the breakdown of an awful lot of facilitation in Extinction Rebellion, which has also been a big learning journey for me, about how do you deal with like a room full of very opinionated, difficult people. It's been quite a good learning curve probably for me to go on in terms of how hard these rooms could be. So I don't know, somehow this conversation's been about power, Claire, a lot. Isn't it?
Thanks, Claire. To be honest, if I can just add one tiny thing, one thing that this has shown me is actually questions of definition are really important. But what actually everyone in this room has given me is like quite confidence to redefine and keep redefining what all of these terms mean actually, and that it's completely okay to do that as we go along. And that's been actually really quite just empowering actually, to think, yeah, we can redefine this. This is okay. I did promise that as a facilitator in a room of facilitators talking about facilitation, I would be under pressure to end it bang on time. And so, but I actually genuinely do feel that horrible feeling as well of like, oh, I think we've only just got started, and I say that genuinely actually, with a little bit of regret that we're going to we're going to end it now, but hopefully the conversations, you know, we're in touch. And actually, it's been really great for me and Claire to meet people who are in this world, in this space, doing this work, and to read your work and to act and to have these conversations. So it's not the end. Josh, ceremonially, ritually, we come to you at the end for you to show your work to us if you can. I'll try to make you that you can share your screen. And if any of you want to see what Josh is doing now, he's going to speak or sing while he shows his screen. So it comes up as the main thing. So if you go to view and speaker in the top right-hand corner, then Josh will be able to share his screen, I hope.
Yes, let's do this. There we go. There's quite, as a room of facilitators, virtual room, there's a lot of verbiage. So it's quite word heavy, but I have tried to capture some of the keywords in there. I won't go through them because they're spinning around your heads as we speak.
No.
But I've put them down there, and I shall continue to add a few bits and pieces after this conversation that when they come to mind, and share with the group.
Brilliant. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, and we'll share this out as soon as it's completed. And Martin Rowe, who's been sitting there quietly absorbing it all, might even write us a little poem or something to send out as well, might you, Martin? Who knows? Who knows? But part of the reason why Martin and Josh and Jeremy and Ed are here and have been pitching in, and why a couple of others, Paul and Rosanna, who couldn't be here, part of the reason why we're here is because we want to work on this culturally and creatively as well, in terms of how does this move from this moment outwards in different forms. So we'll be sharing that, and we'll be wrapping that all up at the end of the series. This is the second of 6 dialogues. We'll be hosting more fortnightly, and then maybe some of you will come to some of them. But we're definitely going to invite everyone back for the wrap up in December, when we bring these dialogues to a close. So I think it's just down to me to say thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate your time and your generosity and everything you've shared. So, and we will be in touch.
And let's save the chat, because we
will save the chat. Yes.
So much.
Thank
you.
And we will share that.
Good to see you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm so grateful for all your wisdom.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you. See you soon.
Are we sharing emails? Is there a if this is being shared, can we share emails?
Sure. Yeah, I'd send around everyone, but we'll share that. Yep.
Right. Thank you. Bye. Thank you both. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.